table is set for us to have the competitive advantage, the enduring competitive advantage.
Well, hi once again, everybody. Welcome back to the Comstock channel. I'm Marlin Bohling with you. As always, remember to like these videos, subscribe to the videos by clicking that bell icon down below, and then also make sure you share these videos with others as we continue to grow our audience thanks to your help. Thanks for doing that. Well, today I'm joined by Mike Steenhoek. Now, he is with the Soybean Transportation Coalition, and I thought it was important to have Mike come on board today to talk about the situation regarding the Longshoreman strike. We have flooding on the river system. We have some new developments on the rail systems and everything. So a lot to talk about. And Mike, I wanted to start with the big 800-pound gorilla in the room, and that would be the Longshoreman strike. It's causing ripple effects throughout the economy already. What is that having to do with agriculture from your perspective here?
Yeah, so you have the two negotiating parties. One is called the International Longshoremen's Association, and that's the organization, the union, that represents the dock workers that service the East Coast ports, the Gulf Coast ports, and some on the Great Lakes. But the real impact of this is along the East Coast and the Gulf Coast primarily. And then the other party is what's called the U.S. Maritime Alliance, and that's the organization that represents the port authorities, the port operators, and then the ocean vessel companies that utilize those particular ports. And the contract, the 6-year contract between the two parties expired on September 30th, and there was an unwillingness to extend the terms of that contract into the future to allow more time for negotiations. So as a result, the strike commenced at 12:01 Eastern Time a.m. on October 1st, and so the strike is continuing. And how this impacts agriculture is it relates to those imports and exports that occur in shipping containers, and these are the 20 or 40 foot in length steel boxes that you see on ocean vessels. That they can be they're called intermodal containers, so they can go from one mode of transportation to the next. So from ocean vessels to rail cars, and they can be put on truck chassis. And so those are the shipments that are impacted by this, as well as what's called roll-on, roll-off cargo. And so that's things like automobiles and tractors and any kind of machinery that you can drive onto ocean vessels and drive off them. It does not impact bulk shipping. And for those who are familiar with the agricultural supply chain, there's a lot of export terminals for soybeans, for grain around the New Orleans area. And those are bulk export facilities. And that's where you're essentially loading the empty cargo holds of an ocean vessel with about 2.5 million bushels of soybeans. And so you're just basically pouring those soybeans into the cargo hold. So those facilities are not impacted by this because those facilities have a different arrangement with a different labor union, or they might have their own workforce that service those ocean vessels. So, and that's the vast majority of how soybeans are exported from this country. About 90% of soybean exports occur via bulk. So this current strike does not impact that percentage, but it does impact those soybeans and soybean meal that are exported via containers. So that it's really problematic for those exporters who rely on that mode of transportation. So obviously a real concern in that regard. Also for our industry, we're very concerned about the impact on meat and poultry exports. And those occur via refrigerated containers. And of course, meat and poultry shipments do not have an indefinite shelf life. They are perishable. And so you just don't have the luxury of saying, let's just park this container off to the side and wait for the impasse to subside, however long that may be, because the clock is ticking on shipments like that. It's kind of similar to the fresh fruits and vegetables that we export and import into the United States. And so for meat exports, that's a real concern for us because you can't have harm imposed on the U.S. meat industry and poultry industry without also having a detrimental impact on U.S. soybean farmers. It's kind of we're linked. It's by far our number one market for the soybean meal that is produced. And a lot of that in turn is fed into livestock, and some of it's retained here domestically, but a lot of it is exported. And so that's a real concern that we have as we move forward. So we're obviously hoping for a resolution as soon as possible.
I would think there would be a huge impact on the things like grocery items, food items coming in from overseas, and also things like hardware and maybe input supplies for farming. Talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, and it really depends on the particular product. So, a lot of importers, the big box retailers, the Walmarts, the Home Depots of this world, the Costcos of this world, they all knew that there was this potential for a strike starting on October 1st. So they did the rational thing is that they accelerated a lot of their imports, front loaded it into the earlier parts of the year. So we are seeing a lot of these distribution centers with very swollen inventory levels because, particularly for the holiday season, they wanted to make sure they had all of those materials for the holiday season. And so that it appears that we have that kind of inventory here in the United States. A lot of those other importers, for regardless of the product, did something very similar, or they're utilizing the West Coast if they have that option available to them. But what is concerning, particularly, are those items where you can't simply bring them in early. So these are things that are on the grocery store shelves that we don't produce in the United States. Bananas are a really good example of that. Um, those are products that are perishable, and so once you kind of go through that inventory, you're going to have to reroute some of those shipments to, say, the West Coast of the United States. There's going to be a cost associated with that if you're having to all of a sudden elect the longer, less convenient option for you. So it really is going to depend on the particular product, and a lot of it is, if it's what's the shelf life of that, or if there's all of a sudden an unexpected surge in demand for a particular product that you did not anticipate, and all of a sudden you have to increase the supply of it. Well, all of a sudden your ability to do that is exceedingly limited. So you will see. It depends on how long this strike lasts, but with each passing day, the inconvenience and the harm it imposes on the U.S. economy will become more and more pronounced.
Is there any potential for this to spill over into what I call sympathy strikes, like with the bulk carrier or the bulk ship loaders and unloaders, and maybe the West Coast Union, even though they're on a different contract? I mean, could that spur something like that?
Yeah, that's always been the real question. At least thus far, you haven't seen it. But then, there are examples in the past where labor union B will honor the dispute of labor union A, and they'll respect the picket line as kind of the term that's often used, and so they'll often reduce the amount of shipments that they will receive out of respect and solidarity to the other labor union. So that's obviously the big question as we move forward. Now, when there was the West Coast had a similar, didn't result in a strike, but they went through a recent contract renegotiation, and the East Coast actually benefited from that. There was a lot of traffic that was routed to the East Coast out of the concern with the predictability and reliability of the West Coast. And so you didn't see that dynamic of in that case, the East Coast actually benefited at the expense of the West Coast. And so I question whether that will happen, but that is always a possibility that you'll see some of that, that kind of solidarity among labor unions result in more widespread closures and shutdowns, or at least slowdowns at various ports throughout the country.
So if this drags on for a significant amount of time, will that necessarily lead to increases in our input prices on the farm?
It certainly will, the concern is you can see this having both an inflationary impact and also a deflationary impact. So obviously, if you have a supply chain that's more encumbered, less efficient, that puts naturally upward costs on the supply chain. The costs of the things that we purchase will become more expensive. So there's obviously going to be an inflationary impact on this stoppage. But then if you're an exporter, an agricultural exporter, and you rely on the East Coast ports to be able to move your product to your international customers, and you no longer can do so, you're not getting paid. So there's going to be a deflationary impact as well in certain segments of the economy. Either way, it's going to impose significant hardship. And, you know, it's just a constant reminder that supply chains really matter. We've kind of, prior to COVID, we kind of assumed that, like a relay race, that the baton would get efficiently passed between runner number one, runner number two, runner number three, and runner number four. And we no longer have that assurance now. And for a variety of reasons, whether it's weather related, in this case, it's human induced challenges within our supply chain. The baton is not efficiently being passed, and it has an impact on the average American with the cost that they purchase routinely, but then also our ability to export.
Well, Hurricane Helene made its way from the Florida Panhandle or the Big Bend area up through the southeastern U.S., and we've all seen the videos of all that destruction it caused in the mountain areas, the Smoky Mountains, the southern Appalachians. And then it hooked around and headed northwestward. And basically, that's just going to kind of fill up the Tennessee River Basin. It headed over toward the Ohio River Basin, maybe even a little bit of the southern extent of the Illinois River there. But boy, I tell you what, there's a lot of water coming downhill toward the Mississippi. But I don't know if it's really going to make it. There's a lot of dams in between where the flooding took place and the river. But is that actually going to help the navigation now?
Yeah, we have seen water levels respond considerably at places like Memphis, Tennessee, and particularly some of these places further south, New Orleans, a little bit further north of that. But so you have seen some additional precipitation, both for the farm ground. We have a lot of acres that are pretty dehydrated right now. After pretty much the middle part of July, we've had quite a stretch of dry weather, and so that's dehydrated the ground, and also water levels on the rivers, particularly the Mississippi, have retreated considerably. Now we've seen that reverse a bit as of late, and it'll be interesting to see how long that continues with as you mentioned, the additional water that makes its way to, rivers like the Tennessee, the Kentucky, the Ohio, and obviously the Mississippi itself. Whether that has an impact on navigation right now, it's provided some benefit to barge transportation. But then the question is always, once you have this big influx of water, you can be, a number of days afterwards, and you can be right back where you were beforehand. And so that's something that we're obviously going to be watching as things move forward.
Have you noticed any changes in barge freight rates or loading capacity in the last few days?
Over the last few days, we haven't seen a huge impact, but that's something that I expect to see in the future. Hopefully, a little bit of a retreat of barge freight rates. But the thing is, with those rates, they really look at more of a longer perspective. And so the question is, what river levels will be consistently and predictably moving forward? And so that's obviously the big question. And obviously our hope is that we will have some additional water make its way into the system, so that you're not putting there's not as much constraint on the supply of barge transportation right now, because you have to load barges lighter. You can't put as many barges together to form one single unit. And so what we've seen up to this point is an upward pressure on barge freight rates. Hopefully that will relax a bit, particularly during this time of the year where we need our supply chain to be operating at full throttle. We've got, by all indications, a significant harvest that continues to come online. So we need to make sure our supply chain is accommodating that as much as possible.
Can you give us a status update on the rail systems? Of course, we had the Canadian rail strike a while back, and then we also had a shutdown of rail activity going into Mexico when it came to grain shipments heading south. Where do we stand on those right now? Because that's kind of important during harvest here.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we naturally get concerned about, because Mexico is we will have a natural competitive advantage with Mexico, and Mexico is a very important market for us, and it's been one of the bright spots in the export program for U.S. agriculture the last couple of years. Amidst some of these challenges that we have with China and some of these other countries where exports have either plateaued or they've even retreated a bit, Mexico still remains a very important market for us. And again, the table is set for us to have the competitive advantage, the enduring competitive advantage into the Mexican market. But you have to make sure you've got a reliable rail system that can feed into it. We do export some into Mexico via ocean vessel going across the Gulf of Mexico, but most of it does occur by rail. And there has been some real challenges for the Western U.S. carriers, particularly the BNSF Railway and Union Pacific, that once they get into Mexico and hand it off to their Mexican freight rail counterparts, that the service has not been as reliable. There hasn't been as much rail supply devoted to those shipments, and because they've been devoted to other particular customers. And so what's happened is those two rail companies, Union Pacific and BNSF, have limited the amount of service into the Mexican market because they don't have confidence that, again, to use the track and field analogy, that once they hand off the baton to their Mexican counterpart, that the delivery will actually occur. Now, we have seen some improvement in this area where BNSF has resumed those shipments and those offerings to customers, which is obviously really good news. We need to see that continue, though, into the future. But again, it's just another example that you can grow the crop, you can have demand for that crop, but if you don't have effective transportation that connects supply with demand, you're not going to be profitable.
Well, Mike, always great to visit with you. Thanks so much for the update on all the transportation issues. There's a lot going on, and I appreciate that so much. We'll talk with you again soon. That's Mike Steenhoek, and he is with the Soybean Transportation Coalition. That'll do it for this episode. Thanks again for joining us. For producer Brianne Hendrickson, I'm Marlin Bohling. We'll catch you next time right here on the Comstock channel. Futures trading involves risk. The risk of loss in trading futures and/or options is substantial, and each investor and/or trader must consider whether this is a suitable investment. Past performance is not indicative of future results.